Hey group, so this lesson is all about experiments. And in any good experiment, you're going to have independent variable, dependent variable, some controls, and a control group. So I need to make sure that you know what all those are so we can start planning our experiments. So here we go. Let's make up an experiment. So our experiment right now we want to know how many worms it takes to feed a panda before it turns green. I know it doesn't make sense, but we're going to go with it. So here's our experiment. All right, now, in the experiment, there's an independent variable. So what an independent variable is, it's what we're testing out. Okay, it's what we're trying to figure out. It's what we're manipulating. So in this experiment, we're trying to figure out how many worms it takes. So our independent variable would then be the amount of worms, how many worms there are, because we're going to try out 1 worm, 3 worms, 6 worms. So it's what we're experimenting with. So your independent variable is what you're experimenting with. So that's your independent variable. Now, this is important. In any good experiment, there should be only one independent variable. So let's say that we wanted to see how many worms it took to make them turn green, but we also wanted to turn the temperature way down, or we wanted to make them live in a certain area. Then if they turned green, we wouldn't know if it was because of the worms or because of the temperature or where they were living. So that's why you always want to have only one thing in a good experiment that you're testing out at any given time. Now, there's something called the dependent variable. So we know the amount of worms that we're giving that panda is your independent variable, right? It's what we're testing out. The dependent variable is essentially the results. What happens? So if we give them 3 worms, we're trying to figure out this, the dependent variable. So in this case, it would be if it turned green or not, okay? So independent variable is how many worms, and the results are yes, it turned green, no, it didn't. Okay, let's try 3 worms as our, and then as an independent variable, and then nope, still didn't turn green. So the number of worms in this case is independent. Whether or not it turned green is dependent. I always think of dependent is the results. If you ever get them confused, dependent is the results. And if you think of the name, dependent means that it needs something. So dependent is dependent on how many worms you give them. Okay. So it's dependent on the independent variable. Now, in any good experiment, you also are going to have controls. What controls are is it's all the things you do in an experiment to make sure it is accurate. So if we said we're going to give 1 panda 1 worm, 1 3 worm, 1 5 worm, we would do controls. So even though the pandas might be getting different numbers of worms, they would get, let's see, the same amount of water. Let's see what else I did. They would have the same amount of water, and you use the same type of panda, and they live in the same environment, and it'd be the same time of day, and everything else would be exactly the same. The only difference would be the number of worms you give them. These are called controls, things in the experiment you're trying to control. The hard part is it's really, really hard to make sure every experiment is exactly the same. So you're going to end up having other things that go wrong. So you try your best to have as many controls as possible. Now, control group is different, which is confusing because it has the same word, controls. But in a control group, what this is, it's the group that you're not testing. And you don't always have a control group. It's the group you're not experimenting on. So in this situation, what you would do is you'd have all your pandas lined up. You say, okay, you're going to be 1 worm, you guys are going to be 3 worms, you'll be 5 worms, and then you'd have another group which you'd give no worms to. And they're the control group. And the reason you have that is it's a basis of comparison, because you want to make sure that you know it's the worms making them turn green. Because if that group turns green, then maybe it has nothing to do at all with the worms, and maybe it's the temperature or something else. So that's why you have a control group, a group you're not testing on. Again, you don't always have one, but if you can have one, you'll have one. Now, like we said, it's the group you wouldn't give any worms to. Now let's try another experiment. What I want to do is I'm going to explain the experiment. You pause the video and see if you could figure out the independent variable, dependent controls, control group. Okay, so here's the experiment. You're testing out different types of car wax to see which one makes your car shine the best. Pause the video, think in your head, which are the variables? Okay, hopefully you paused it. In this one, the independent variable, what we're testing out are the different types of wax. It's what we're trying, this wax, that wax, that wax, independent variable, type of wax. Dependent variable, or the results, would be how shiny the car is. Okay, level of shininess. Controls in this one, you'd use the same amount of water, you'd use the same amount of sunlight, the same driveway, the same everything else would be controls. In control group, in this case, you would be, maybe you do the whole car, and you do this section with this wax, this section with this wax, this section with this wax, and you have a certain section where you did no wax at all. That would be your control group. Or if you want to do different cars, this car with one wax, this car with one wax, and this car with no wax at all. That would be your control group. So a section or a car, entire car that you would do no experimenting on. So independent variable, what you're testing, dependent variable, results, controls, things you're keeping the same, and control group is the group you're not experimenting on. Hope you understand, and as always, ask any questions that you have to make sure you understand this.